was Robert Jones? A gourmand and connoisseur by his own definition, he was also a man with a sharp and incisive mind. He had a good instinct for strategy and was a well-practiced tactician. He was a consummate networker with formidable political skills. Robert easily built alliances and gathered support for his position, which was, uncompromisingly, the right of access and inclusion for people with disabilities in the life of the nation. Robert's unflinching commitment to this right placed him at the heart of the process that developed the disability standards for accessible public transport and the access to premises standards. And he gave expert evidence in the renowned Queensland Convention and Exhibition Centre court case. Robert used a wheelchair for personal mobility, but never did he allow this to define him. Robert defined himself by force of intellect and personality. He refined this definition further through his work, and it is through our labours that we are after all judged. We are told that every tree is known by its own fruit. The fruit of Robert's labour has been good indeed, and many, myself included, have tasted the benefits of it. To our loss, Robert Jones died on May 12, 2013. More importantly, and on the credit side of the ledger, he was born in 1958, a very good year, in the month of May, an excellent month to be born in. Robert always told me to respect my elders, mostly because he was a few days older than I was. He was only half joking. But respect for Robert was never a thing that anyone lacked. He may have been loved, liked, or loathed, but Robert was always respected. Robert has always earned, and even those who argued for different opinions and outcomes, respected Robert for his integrity, principle, and dogged consistency in the face of their intransigence. I once asked Robert why he had made access and inclusion for people with disabilities his life's work. Robert was never one for explaining himself, but on this occasion he did. Well, it's the injustice of it all, he responded, and then explained no further. Injustice for who, I wondered. Robert's areas of commitment explained who. People who could not access appropriate housing, public transport, or public premises. And yet Robert did not actually fit any of these categories. He owned a well-designed house in a leafy suburb that suited him perfectly, right down to the accessible wine cellar. Robert did not use public transport. He drove a BMW, claiming that parts were cheap, and could talk anyone into providing him with free parking. To my knowledge, his only use of public transport was with taxis when interstate, though I do recall one recreational excursion on the now defunct Sydney monorail. Robert was determined that we should see this great wonder and was equally determined not to pay a fare. If they ask us to pay, we'll tell them we're invalid pensioners, he had whispered it conspiratorially to me. Robert charmed the lady at the platform entrance though, and we passed without challenge. I still don't know what a monorail fare costs, or even if fares were charged. Robert was seldom challenged in gaining access to public premises. He would find a way in or charm a way in no matter what. While in Paris, Robert once convinced the maitre d' of La Tour d'Argent into providing a guided tour of their renowned and well-guarded wine cellar. No mean feat for an Anglophone. Access to inaccessible European hotels was never an issue for Robert, even if it meant co-opting a small army of bellhops into providing portage up and down the stairs. Rather, the injustice that motivated Robert was not personally experienced, but he witnessed it in the lives of others and was determined that injustice should end. So let's consider the three prime issues that Robert confronted. First up, housing. The most important building in any person's life is their place of residence. If places of residence suitable to their needs are not available, people become trapped in institutions, medical establishments, or accommodation that puts them at risk of poor health or insecurity of tenure. Robert knew that first and foremost, people need a safe, secure place to live. Safe, secure housing is not only a right, it is a matter of survival. Housing is also a primary location for socialising, and Robert well knew that it was in his friends' houses that the best food was prepared and shared, the best wine tasted, and the best conversations had. On the matter of transport, once people have a place to live, they are able to begin considering how they will participate in society. Understanding this, Robert put much energy into the development of accessible public transport. Without the means to successfully travel, people become trapped at home. They are at risk then of social isolation and exclusion. Unless they can work from home, they have little opportunity for employment. On the subject of premises, if people cannot enter or use the facilities in the built environment, they are unable to participate in the economic, cultural, or recreational activities available. People are then marginalised and become invisible members of the undeserving poor. Aware that the only way to force change was through law, Robert launched himself into the legal field. His first major challenge was the Queensland Convention and Exhibition Centre case. So that Robert could be called as a witness, a young firebrand named Kevin Cox stepped up to take on the might of the state of Queensland. The celebrated Cox versus State of Queensland case was won, and in the blink of an eye, the Building Code of Australia was changed to require that the principal entrance of any new public building must be accessible. With his reputation secured, Robert became part of the process of developing the disability standards for accessible public transport. A disability standard was formulated under the Commonwealth's Disability Discrimination Act. The DSAP, as it's known, has revolutionised public transport in Australia and forced transport operators and providers to reinvent their policies, procedures and procurement. Robert's magnum opus, though, was the Disability Standards for Access to Public Buildings, or usually known as the Premises Standards. This document allowed the Building Code of Australia and the Disability Discrimination Act's provisions for access to public buildings to be read as one document. The DDA's requirements for access to premises entered the regulatory environment, and industry, the public and the courts had certainty as to what DDA compliance actually meant. Robert sometimes mused that the moment rights are codified, they are diminished, but was canny enough to understand that undefined rights can only be defended via the vicissitudes of the legal system. In this onerous legal process, resources frequently triumph over rights. Robert's genius, therefore, was to help guide rights to codification and from thence into a regulatory environment where the resources of the state would be employed to ensure the rights of access to premises and transport. He then undertook to ensure that the diminution of rights was minimised, playing his pieces as might a chess grandmaster in the standards development process. The battle was fought with Robert's usual charm, networking, procedural rigour, or attention to factual detail. Now, of Robert's three interests, only housing remains unregulated. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities stipulates that access to appropriate housing is a right. Alas, in Australia we have no legal instruments with which to assert this right. The challenge for us, therefore, is to navigate a course by which we might bring private housing into a regulated environment. Robert's skills will be sadly missed in this process. Nevertheless, remembering his example, we will press on towards the mark with codification and regulation of the right to housing as our destination. Now, a life cannot be summed up in 5 minutes, and I've not attempted to do so. Rather, I've given what I hope was the flavour of a man and the taste of what he had to offer. This taste will lead us on to the subsequent speaker, who will go beyond my aperitif to the main course of our evening. Thank you.
First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and pay respects to elders past and present. I've found a new definition for inclusion. It's you matter because you are you and you matter to the last moment of your life. I have the honour to present the inaugural Robert Jones Memorial Oration to propose that because everyone matters, there is a public interest in the design of private housing. I will first set the scene and challenge some assumptions that I believe confuse this debate. Then I will argue there are human rights, social and economic imperatives for this public interest. And finally, I will propose some ideas about what is needed for housing design to play its part towards a truly inclusive society where everyone matters. Robert Jones visited our home regularly on a Saturday night for a roast dinner. He came because he was our friend, and he came because he could get in the door. He talked to us about his dream to make public spaces and places accessible to everyone, when equitable access would be accepted and expected. His dream is now practice through a prescriptive standard enshrined in legislation and called up in the National Construction Code. This practice, however, stops at the front door of our homes, where public space becomes private. Most of us, though committed to equity and inclusion, live in homes that many people with disability cannot visit. Our commitment stops at our front door. So what role does private space, the space we call home, play in creating inclusive communities? And who is responsible? To begin, I will share with you two personal stories which have guided my thinking. My father, a successful and respected professional, lived until he was 96. For the last 2 years of his life, he was blind, frail, and barely able to get around. Due to many factors, he was able to stay in his own home until the last days of his life. To the end, he had things to do and important roles to fill. Here, a few months before he died, he welcomed a mother and daughter who came as refugees to Australia into his home. After he died, they told me he changed their lives. He gave them hope for a future. My daughter, on the other hand, lived a humble and difficult life. She died at the age of 29. Similarly, she was able to live in her own home until the end. Destined to have a short life, she lived longer than predicted. Her home, her family, and her friends, and the many tasks she had to do kept her full of purpose. Both of these people relied on good housing designed to live their lives to the full. Overwhelmingly, the evidence shows that Australians want to age in place, live independently, and actively engage in their communities for as long as possible. We want to live, get old, and die in our own homes. It takes many things for people to live at home and remain there. Australians have agreed that it's in the public interest that people receive reasonable and necessary supports and affordable medical services to keep participating and contributing in community. There is no equivalent public interest in the design of housing. Housing design has not responded well to people with disability and older people. Why? Because the design of private spaces has largely been seen the province of a speculative housing industry and individual acts of self-interest. The private housing market, affecting 95% of our housing stock, has largely ignored the needs of people with disability and frail older people, because this group have little or no buying power. Most of our housing is unsuitable for them, and as a consequence, many people become shut in, isolated in their own homes, shut out of the homes of others, and excluded from their communities altogether. The National Construction Code, which addresses issues of design and performance across Australia, has no access requirements for the private spaces in housing. Government and industry representatives consider a regulatory approach unnecessary and support a voluntary market-driven response to this need. So what in reality are we talking about? There are various responses to this problem. For example, there's adaptable, accessible, universal, inclusive and visitable housing. Today I'm focusing on the idea of visitable housing. And this is because there is an agreement amongst Australian housing industry and community leaders alike that as a minimum, for communities to be inclusive, dwellings should be visitable. That is, they should allow a person to visit, have a cup of tea, go to the toilet, stay overnight at short notice, and leave with dignity. This means 4 things. A step-free entry to and into the dwelling, doors and corridors on the entry level to be wide enough for a wheelchair, a toilet and shower that can be used by most people, and capacity to install grab rails in the toilet and shower if and when they are needed. With these features, a dwelling can cope with most situations. Grandma with her walker can come for Christmas dinner. You can get home from hospital with your broken leg. And your mate in a wheelchair can join you for a few beers to watch the Broncos game on the telly. And changes can be made more easily to meet individual long-term needs over time. A Livable Housing Australia, a non-government body representing both community and industry members, has courage of this agreement and has the endorsement of government at all 3 levels through the COAG process. It has taken a national approach. It has set clear guidelines, measurable targets and strategies with the aspirational goal that all new housing will be visitable by 2020. The philosopher Iris Marion Young suggests that voluntary initiatives within liberal societies such as ours can stimulate cooperation, competition and innovation, and have the power to address systemic social injustice without the heavy hand of government. Livable Housing Australia follows this thinking. I argue, however, Livable Housing Australia has made 3 assumptions which are unfounded, and that this voluntary initiative is unlikely to work. The first assumption is that the housing market will respond to the need for visitable housing. To own your own home remains the Australian dream, and the sales pitch most of us prefer to hear denies our vulnerability. Research has shown that with few exceptions, most people prefer not to think about, let alone plan for, their frailty or disablement, or caring for a frail aged partner. Buyers are simply not interested in paying for features that they do not think they will need, or for the sake of the public good. And salespeople are not keen to emphasise these features as a selling point. It is not surprising that the demand for visitable housing on the sales room floor is very low. Most new housing is built by volume builders who remain competitive by using standardised designs and building practices, tight schedules and mass production. So for those few who want to break the mould and want access features, the process is expensive and often discouraged. So some would say the housing market does respond to need. There are different housing types: student housing, family homes, retirement villages, group homes for people with disabilities, social housing and high-end luxury units. This assumes that when your home is no longer suitable, you're able to sell up and move, modify your existing home, or find a new tenancy in a planned way as your needs change, and many people do. However, sometimes life changes without warning. Moving and modifying is not an option, and we do not have time, the money, or the capacity or the will for such change. And the social, economic, and emotional costs of no longer having suitable housing are then picked up by the health, disability, and aged care sectors in finding alternatives, and the original builders are long gone. What happens in the long term is simply not the concern of the housing industry. The second assumption is that it makes good business sense to build visitable housing. The housing industry falls into two groups: the volume builders, who primarily build new housing, and a secondary group which concentrates on renovating existing housing. That is, repairs, additions, alterations and modifications. And this is a growth industry, and modifying existing housing for older people and people with disabilities is a significant part of this business. A consequence of current housing design is that the housing industry has, in effect, more than one bite of the cherry. Now, this would infer a considered plot against building inclusive communities. And I don't think this is so. I believe the housing industry just has different priorities. As one builder explained, "Margaret, we just build houses that sell. We do not think or care about social inclusion." The third assumption is that by making accessible features fashionable, we will have more visitable housing. One often hears many of these features are now in demand. Hob-free showers are now the trend. Double garages with wide driveways right into the dwelling are handy for wheelchairs. Generous doorways with lever handles, large en-suites and spacious entertainment areas are considered the norm. It is fashionable to have these accessible features. These features have been provided by what the 18th century philosopher Adam Smith called the invisible hand, where private individuals acting in their own interest promote the public good, even though it is no part of their original intention. Some access is provided unintentionally to some people in some places some of the time. The outcome does not provide a coherent and consistent accessible path of travel. The step-free driveway leads to a step at the door. The wide front door leads to a narrow corridor, and the narrow internal doorway does not allow entry for a wheelchair into the spacious bathroom. At first glance beneficial, these individual acts of self-interest are no more than crumbs under the table for people who are struggling to be included. A colleague of mine who uses a chair said, "I used to visit my friend's home often. She was able to bump me up the front step, but now she's older and not so strong, and she doesn't invite me anymore." Nearly 4 years on, since the industry agreed to change their practices voluntarily to visitable housing, the response has been poor. And I show here, this is a graph. The yellow, the blue is the amount of housing that's built each year across Australia, around 140,000 dwellings a year. The yellow is the anticipated targets of Livable Housing Australia to encourage the housing industry to provide visitable features in their housing. And you can see by 2020 the aspirational goal there of all new housing being visitable. And the red in 2013 is the reported housing that has accessible features. And we can see what they anticipate for 2015. So, why continue? It looks a bit hard. Why can't we just take individual responsibility for our housing? A home is our last bastion of privacy. Why is it the interest of others, where and how we choose to live, grow old and die? And besides, why should our homes be visitable to everyone? I suggest that there are 3 imperatives for a public interest in the design of private housing. There's a human rights, an economic and a social imperative. The first is the human rights imperative. In 2007, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities brought a particular focus to the broadly accepted right to social inclusion by promoting the right of people with disability to access all aspects of the physical and social environment on an equal basis with others. The cross-cutting nature of this convention not only directs how housing assistance is offered, that is, people with disability have the right to choose their place of residence and where and with whom they live on an equal basis with others, but it also challenges how housing should be designed. The design of environments should be usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialised design. Now, the Australian government is accountable to the international community for ensuring that the rights set out in the Convention are respected. The obligations affecting housing supply are considered to be progressively realisable. That is, the Australian government does not have to immediately fully comply to this obligation, but must work to fulfil these obligations over time. Further, any progressive action must match the level of resources a nation has available to it. This is justification for a public interest in the design of private spaces and in the progress of this voluntary agreement, that the targets are met and that if they are not met, alternative action is taken. And this leads to the economic imperative. So how much does visitable housing actually cost? How many should be made visitable? And what are the benefits? The Victorian government in 2010 estimated the cost of a new dwelling to be visitable is very low. So we can see here that the cost in a low-rise unit is $190 $90. This is at the point of design, at new construction. So the cost of a party dress. And for a high-rise unit with an elevator, it is $1,000. The cost to retrofit the same features is 19 times greater. The housing industry argues it costs more than that. A generally accepted estimate of the average cost by providing these features is around $5,000. From my research, I consider the estimate is fair if the change process is taken into account. The industry must factor in the cost for them to cease their old practice, find new suppliers, get everyone to accept a new way of doing things. One builder explained to me, I can change my designs easily, but then I must go on site for each job and stand over my subcontractors to make sure they don't just keep doing the same old thing. Oddly, this is the main reason why the construction industry prefers a regulatory approach, as in the National Construction Code. It sets a minimum standard, manages the unintended long-term consequences of building practice, and provides a level playing field for everyone. Everyone must change together. But does every newly constructed dwelling need to be visitable? Let's consider this from the viewpoint of the dwelling. A comprehensive United States study estimates that given the ageing and disabled population, the preferences to remain at home, a family's average length of stay, and the anticipated life of a dwelling, 60% of newly constructed single-family dwellings would have a resident requiring access features. If visitors are taken into account, the figure rises to 91%. So given that Australia's demographics and housing supply are similar to that to the United States, these figures add weight to the benefit of a national regulated process. In 2010, the Victorian government identified the principal benefits of providing visitable housing as enhanced safety and amenity, greater social inclusion and social capital. At that time, they found the quantifiable net benefit would not be realised for some time. However, considering the number of families that would be affected over the lifetime of the dwelling and the unquantifiable benefits of equity and inclusion, they proposed regulation. And in 2013, the ACT government did the same. This argument for a long-term vision should be even more compelling now the NDIS and aged care reforms are being rolled out. These unquantifiable benefits lead to the third, the social imperative. Older people and people with disabilities do not live and should not live isolated lives. Social inclusion does not just happen, and it's not static. It is a process of building and maintaining relationships and capacities over time. It happens through hundreds of everyday reciprocal interactions. It happens in private spaces, and it is what binds families and communities together. The design of housing directly facilitates opportunities to develop intimate relationships, pass on family values and traditions, raise children, provide mutual support, and solve everyday problems. Housing design directly impacts on who is included, who matters, and who gets in the door. So if we are committed to equity and inclusion of all people, we must first understand deeply how and where equity and inclusion starts. We must take then an active and public interest in the design of our private spaces and expect to be included no matter who we are as we live, grow old and die. Further, that interest and expectation should be safeguarded through legislation as it is for public spaces, not through the vagaries of market forces or fashion, so that the requirements are clear, everyone understands, everyone is committed, and everyone benefits. So who is responsible for this action? Again, Iris Marion Young suggests that when it comes to addressing social injustice, we fall into 4 broad groups. The first group are those who are in positions of power, who understand the impacts of social inclusion and do nothing. The people in this group are few. They are not only responsible, but they are guilty of their inaction. The second group are not guilty, but are responsible by association. The thousands of people that make up the housing industry, developers, designers, builders, suppliers and buyers, go about their daily business unaware of their individual housing decisions and how they contribute to social exclusion. When brought to their attention, they consider they have little impetus from their leaders or individual power or opportunity to change the status quo. The third group take individual action. They make their homes visitable. They build visitable buildings one at a time, and they teach and promote universal design. The fourth group are those who take political responsibility. They take public and collective action to intervene. They call to account people in power who do nothing. And typically they are led by those like Robert Jones who are most affected, who know deeply what social exclusion means. Perhaps this is a moment to reflect which group you fall into. With some exceptions, government at all levels have handed over the responsibility to Livable Housing Australia to improve the supply of visitable housing. Livable Housing Australia has not met its targets. Powerful industry and industry interests have successfully advocated against the plans for regulation in Victoria and the ACT. And a recent review of Livable Housing Australia agreement suggests that many of the original supporters have simply lost interest. At this point, it looks like the representatives of the fourth group will need to act, to call those in power to account. They will need to continue the work of Robert Jones and his colleagues in their quest for equity and inclusion in the design of our buildings, started 2 decades ago. They will need to engender public interest in the design of our private spaces. They will be unpopular and they will be dismissed, as Robert Jones often was. They will continue, however, because they know that to have truly inclusive communities, we must all matter, and we must matter to the last moment of our lives. Sorry. Wrong word. I hope the inaugural Robert Jones Memorial Oration, has been useful, and I thank you for listening.